He got more hits than anyone who has ever played baseball, 4,256 of them, a record that has stood for decades and might never fall. And yet, the man who owns it spent the last 35 years of his life locked out of the one place that was supposed to celebrate him. He wasn't allowed inside the Baseball Hall of Fame. He couldn't even be considered. For over 3 decades, Major League Baseball treated him like he didn't exist. Then he died, and a few months later, everything changed. The same league that refused to forgive him while he was alive suddenly reversed the rule that had stood since 1989. To understand how a legend falls that far and how forgiveness can show up decades too late, you have to go back to where it all started. A kid from Cincinnati who nobody thought would make it in the first place. Pete Rose grew up on the west side of Cincinnati, in a working-class family that didn't have much room for excuses. His father played semi-pro football well into his 40s, and that same stubborn, throw-your-body-into-it mentality got passed straight down to his son. Scouts weren't impressed early on. He was small, he wasn't especially fast, and his swing wasn't textbook. Most teams passed on him without a second look. The Cincinnati Reds signed him almost as an afterthought, and even then, nobody inside the organization expected much. What they got instead was a player who refused to play the game at anything less than full speed, all the time, no matter the situation. He sprinted to first base on a walk. He slid headfirst into bases when nobody else did. During a meaningless spring training game, he ran hard to first on a walk so many times that opposing veterans started mocking him behind his back. One of those veterans gave him a nickname meant as an insult, Charlie Hustle. Rose wore it like a badge of honor for the rest of his career, and it stuck for good reason. He wasn't the most talented guy on the field most nights. He was just the one who refused to stop moving. That relentless style turned into results faster than anyone predicted. He won Rookie of the Year in 1963, and from there, he built one of the most productive careers the sport has ever seen. He won 3 batting titles, he made 17 All-Star appearances at 5 different positions, which almost never happens in baseball, where players tend to lock into one spot for life. Managers kept moving him around because wherever he stood, the lineup got better, and he never once complained about the switch. He was named MVP of the National League in 1973, a season where he hit over .330 and led the league in hits yet again. He helped anchor the legendary Cincinnati Big Red Machine teams of the mid-1970s, a lineup stacked with future Hall of Famers like Johnny Bench, Joe Morgan, and Tony Pettis. That roster won back-to-back World Series titles in 1975 and 1976, and is still talked about today as one of the most dominant collections of talent the sport has ever produced. Rose wasn't the biggest name on that roster, but he was arguably its heartbeat, the guy who set the tone every single night with the way he played. He later spent time with the Philadelphia Phillies, where he helped deliver the franchise its first World Series championship in 1980, and even had a short stint with the Montreal Expos before returning home to Cincinnati to finish out his career where it started. But the number that came to define him, more than any award, any ring, or any roster he ever played on, was hits. Year after year, he kept collecting them in a way that felt almost mechanical. By the early 1980s, people around the league started doing the math and realizing something historic was actually within reach. He had a real shot at breaking the all-time hits record, a mark held by the legendary Ty Cobb since the 1920s and considered by most experts to be untouchable. By the early 1980s, Rose had taken on a dual role as both player and manager for the Reds, a demanding job that meant he was responsible for making lineup decisions and in-game strategy calls, while still trying to squeeze out hits as a player well into his 40s. Most athletes that age are retired, doing broadcast work, or coaching from the bench. Rose was still stepping into the batter's box on a nightly basis, chasing a record most people thought would never be touched again.
On September 11, 1985, playing at home in Cincinnati, Rose lined the single into left center field for career hit number 4,192, officially breaking Cobb's record that had stood for 57 years. The stadium erupted. Teammates poured out of the dugout. Fireworks went off. Rose stood on first base and cried in front of a sold-out crowd, and highlights of that moment played on every sports broadcast in the country for days afterward. Commissioners, sports writers, and former players lined up to call it one of the greatest individual achievements the sport had ever witnessed. At that exact point in time, There was no bigger name in baseball. He wasn't just a great player anymore. He was a piece of American sports history. A guy whose name would supposedly be etched into Cooperstown the moment he became eligible. A lock, a formality everyone assumed would happen eventually. Nobody watching that night could have imagined that the same city, the same ballpark, and even the same job he was doing as manager were about to become the reason his career ended in disgrace instead of celebration. Because while all of that was happening on the field, whispers had already started behind the scenes. Rumors began circulating in the baseball world that Rose had a serious gambling habit, and that it wasn't limited to casinos or the horse track, where wagering wasn't against league rules. People close to the game were hearing a much more dangerous claim, that he was betting on baseball itself, including games involving his own team. In a sport where those signs are posted in every single clubhouse in the country, warning players and staff that betting on the game is grounds for permanent banishment, this wasn't a rumor MLB could afford to ignore. Sports Illustrated ran a story in early 1989 detailing associates who claimed Rose owed large sums of money to bookmakers, and from there, the story snowballed fast. In February 1989, Commissioner Bart Giamatti's office opened a formal investigation into Rose's gambling activity. Rose publicly denied everything, calling the accusations ridiculous and insisting he'd never bet on baseball in his life. He even sued to try to block the investigation, arguing he couldn't get a fair hearing. For a while, a lot of fans believed him. He was Charlie Hustle. He was the hit king. It seemed unthinkable that the same guy who ran out walks in spring training would risk his entire legacy like this. But behind the scenes, investigators were building a case that would turn out to be far more damning than most people expected.
Then came the Dowd Report. Named after the lawyer MLB hired to lead the investigation, John Dowd, this 225-page document laid out a mountain of evidence that was almost impossible to explain away. Betting slip, phone records, bank statement, testimony from multiple associates who claimed they placed bets on Rose's behalf, including bets on the Cincinnati Reds while he was managing the team. Some of those associates had reputations tied to illegal bookmaking operation, which only made the paper trail look worse. The report alleged that Rose bet on Reds games on dozens of separate occasions across 1985, 1986, and 1987, sometimes wagering thousands of dollars a day, and that at no point did he ever bet against his own team, which investigators noted, though it did nothing to change the fact that the bets themselves were against the rules. It wasn't a single lapse in judgment. According to the findings, it was a sustained pattern that stretched across multiple seasons, happening at the exact same time he was chasing and eventually breaking the most hallowed record in the sport. When the findings became public, the reaction inside baseball was swift and brutal. This wasn't a fringe accusation anymore. It was documented, cross-referenced, and signed off on by MLB's own investigator. And it left almost no room for the kind of denial Rose had been offering up until that point. Facing overwhelming evidence and the very real threat of a public hearing that could expose even more, Rose agreed to a deal in August 1989. He accepted a permanent, lifetime ban from baseball with the small mercy of being allowed to apply for reinstatement after 1 year, though that door effectively never opened. Notably, the agreement didn't include an official admission of guilt, which let Rose keep publicly denying the core accusation for years afterward, even as the ban stayed firmly in place. Bart Giamatti, the commissioner who signed off on the ban, died of a heart attack just 8 days later, which added a strange, almost eerie footnote to an already dramatic chapter of baseball history. And the fallout didn't stop there. Just months after accepting the ban, Rose pleaded guilty to 2 counts of filing false federal income tax returns tied to unreported income from memorabilia sales and horse racing winnings. He was sentenced to 5 months in a federal prison camp in Illinois, plus a fine and a period of community service afterward. The same year he'd been baseball's biggest hero, standing on first base with tears in his eyes, he was heading to a federal prison camp instead. For a lot of fans, that 1-2 punch was almost impossible to process. Rose walked out of prison in 1991 still insisting, publicly, that he had never bet on baseball at all.
And for the next decade and a half, that denial became the defining feature of his entire post-career life. Repeated in interview after interview, no matter how much evidence sat on the other side of the argument.
And I never understood why they kept you out of the Hall of Fame as a player. I mean, did you ever gamble when you were a player?
Never gambled when I was a player. That's a fact.
What followed was one of the strangest extended stretches in sports history. Rose stayed completely banned from any official role in baseball, which also meant he was ineligible for the Hall of Fame under the institution's own rules, since anyone on MLB's permanently ineligible list is automatically kept off the ballot. Every year, fans and sports writers argued about whether the game's all-time hit king deserved to be locked out of its most prestigious honor. Some argued his on-field accomplishments should stand on their own. Others pointed out that gambling was the one sin baseball had always treated as unforgivable, precisely because it threatens the integrity of the results themselves, and letting it slide for a superstar would set a dangerous precedent. Rose worked the sports memorabilia circuit relentlessly, signing autographs at conventions and card shows for a fee. Sometimes held less than a mile from Hall of Fame induction ceremonies he wasn't invited to attend. There's a certain irony in a man once known for hustling on the field, spending his later decades literally hustling merchandise tables for a living. But Rose leaned into it without much apparent shame. He appeared at old-timers events when teams would allow it. He gave interviews hinting, and sometimes outright arguing, that he deserved a second chance, that the punishment had gone on long enough. Every few years, a new commissioner would take over the league, and every few years, Rose would quietly petition for reinstatement through his lawyers. Every time, the answer stayed the same: no. The gambling issue was treated as close to sacred as anything in the sport, a line MLB refused to move on, regardless of how much time had passed or how much goodwill Rose tried to rebuild with the public. Then, in 2004, Rose finally cracked. In a memoir titled My Prison Without Bars, he admitted publicly for the first time that he had, in fact, bet on baseball, and that he had bet on his own team while managing them. The timing was notable. The book came out right as the Hall of Fame voting cycle was drawing attention, and plenty of people assumed the confession was less about honesty and more about strategy, an attempt to reopen a door that had been shut for 15 straight years. After a decade and a half of denial, the confession barely moved the needle in his favor. If anything, it made things worse. Critics pointed out that he'd waited over 10 years, profited from a tell-all book to finally admit it, and had spent years publicly attacking the credibility of the very Dowd report that turned out to be accurate the entire time. Instead of opening the door to reinstatement, the confession closed it even tighter. Then Commissioner Bud Selig's stance didn't soften at all. If anything, the timing and framing of the admission read to a lot of people as calculated rather than remorseful. And that reputation followed Rose for the rest of his life, resurfacing in nearly every article written about him for the next 20 years. For the next 2 decades, not much changed. He was celebrated by the city, banned by the league. Every commissioner who took the job inherited the same unresolved question, and every one of them left it unresolved by the time they moved on. Pete Rose turned 80 in 2021. He kept giving interviews saying he hoped to see the Hall of Fame before he died, sometimes with more bitterness in his voice than hope. He didn't get that chance. On September 30th, 2024, Pete Rose died at his home in Las Vegas at the age of 83. Tributes poured in from across the sport almost immediately, acknowledging both the historic career and the scandal that had defined his final decades in equal measure. Baseball writers, former teammates, and even players who'd never met him weighed in on what his legacy actually was, and the debate was as split as ever. For most people watching, that looked like the final chapter. The Hit King would go down as one of the greatest and most tragic what-ifs in the sport's history, permanently frozen out of the one recognition he wanted more than anything else. Except that wasn't actually the end of the story. In February 2025, just months after Rose's death, President Donald Trump posted publicly that he intended to grant Rose a full pardon and pushed for MLB to reconsider his status, framing the decades-old ban as excessive and out of step with how other scandals had been handled over the years. It wasn't the first time Trump had voiced support for Rose either. The two had crossed paths before, and Trump had floated similar sentiments in years past, though nothing had ever come of it.
This time was different. Rose's attorney Jeffrey Lenkoff had reportedly been meeting periodically with Commissioner Rob Manfred's office in the months leading up to this, laying the groundwork quietly before the public pressure ever hit. Then, in May 2025, Manfred announced he was reversing decades of policy. He ruled that permanent ineligibility would now end upon the death of the individual involved, reasoning that a person who has passed away can no longer pose any threat to the integrity of the game, and that keeping a dead man on a list meant to deter living players from bad behavior no longer served much purpose. With that single decision, Rose was formally removed from baseball's permanently ineligible list, along with 16 other deceased individuals, including shoeless Joe Jackson, banned back in 1921 for his role in the Black Sox World Series fixing scandal that remains one of the biggest scandals in the sport's history. Manfred later admitted publicly in an interview of CBS Mornings that the decision had been a difficult one and that the political pressure surrounding Rose's case had in fact played a role in the timing of it, even as he framed the ruling as a matter of overdue consistency rather than a favor to any one individual. Not everyone in the baseball world was thrilled about it. Some columnists argued the move quietly rewrote what permanent was ever supposed to mean, sending a message to current players that a lifetime ban simply becomes a very long waiting period instead. The reversal instantly reopened the door that had been sealed for 36 years. With the ban lifted, Rose became eligible for Hall of Fame consideration for the very first time, decades after his career had ended. The process still isn't automatic. The Hall's Historical Overview Committee first has to build a short list of candidates for the Hall's Classic Baseball Era Committee, which only reviews players who made their biggest impact before 1980 and only meets once every 3 years. That committee is scheduled to convene again in December 2027 to vote on a new class for induction in 2028. A candidate needs at least 75% approval from the 16-member panel of Hall of Famers, historians, and writers to get in, the same threshold used in the regular annual vote. That means the possibility that once seemed permanently closed, Pete Rose standing in Cooperstown as an inducted Hall of Famer, could realistically happen more than 3 years after he died, and he'll never get to see it himself. Baseball's all-time hit king may end up enshrined in the sport's most sacred hall after all. He just won't be there for the ceremony, won't get to give the speech, won't get to stand at the podium in front of the crowd the way he always said he wanted to. His family will likely be the one standing there instead, accepting something on his behalf that he spent the last 35 years of his life trying and failing to earn while he was still around to enjoy it. So here's the question we're sitting with. Rose spent the back half of his life fighting for forgiveness he never received while he was alive to actually enjoy it. He kept hustling for it the same way he used to hustle down the first baseline, right up until the very end. The moment that forgiveness finally came, it arrived too late to mean anything to him personally. It's a strange kind of ending for a man defined by relentlessness, by always finding a way to get one more hit, one more shot, one more chance. In the end, the one chance he wanted most only showed up after the game he loved had nothing left to give him. Maybe that's the real story here, about how long people are willing to make someone wait for forgiveness, and what it actually means when that forgiveness only shows up once it can no longer change anything at all.